William Doss found her sitting outside his workshop at 6 in the morning, wrapped in a moving blanket that wasn't hers, eating crackers from a gas station bag. She was maybe 8 years old. He almost drove past. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Heartwarming Tales. He ran a small furniture shop on the edge of Millhaven, a town in upstate New York that had one traffic light and a hardware store that still wrote receipts by hand. William built cabinets and porch swings and the occasional coffin when someone in town passed quietly and didn't want anything fancy. His wife had died 3 years earlier, a bad year with the flu that turned into something worse. And since then it had just been him, the shop, and a dog named Soska that everyone mispronounced and eventually just called Sock. The girl's name was Wren. She didn't tell him that morning. She barely spoke at all, just watched him with the kind of stillness kids get when they've learned that talking sometimes makes things worse. He gave her the rest of his coffee thermos and a blueberry muffin he'd packed for lunch, and he called the county instead of the police because something about her reminded him of his own daughter, who would have been about that age if she'd lived past her first winter. Foster care in that county was thin and overworked. The caseworker, a tired woman named Denise Okafor, told him plainly that Wren had already been through 2 placements that hadn't worked, that she had a habit of running when things felt unsafe, and that most people weren't equipped for that. William said he wasn't most people, though he wasn't sure that was true. He just knew he had a spare room full of lumber offcuts and an empty chair at his kitchen table. It wasn't easy. Wren stole food for the first 4 months, even though there was always plenty in the fridge. Old habits don't leave just because the danger has. She flinched when he raised his voice, even mildly, even about something like leaving the shop door unlocked. She wet the bed until she was almost 11, and she never once, in those early years, called him Dad. She called him William, flat and careful, like she was keeping her options open in case she needed to leave without it costing her too much. He never rushed her. He taught her how to sand a tabletop with the grain, how to tell white oak from red oak by smell, how to fix a squeaky hinge with a pencil and graphite instead of buying new hardware. Small things. He wasn't a man who said much, but he showed up every single day, and eventually that mattered more than anything he could have said. The shift happened slowly, the way real things usually do, not in one big moment, but across 100 small ones. There was the night she was 12 and had a nightmare so bad, she came downstairs shaking, and he sat with her on the porch steps in November without a coat because he didn't want to leave her alone to go get one. There was the time she broke his good chisel trying to help him with a customer's rocking chair and braced for him to yell, and instead he just said, "Well, now we know where that one lives," and handed her the replacement. Somewhere between 14 and 16, William quietly became Dad, and he never made a thing of it, though Denise told him later he'd cried in her office the day he mentioned it. Wren went on to law school on scholarships and a lot of loans, the kind William quietly worried about but never mentioned because he didn't want her to feel like a burden for wanting more than Millhaven could offer. She specialized in something dry-sounding, commercial property law, and moved 2 hours away to Albany, where she worked long hours at a firm that mostly represented small businesses getting squeezed by bigger ones. She called her father every Sunday at 7, without fail, even during bar exam season. The trouble with the shop started 3 years ago, though William didn't tell her at first, because he didn't want to worry her over what he assumed would sort itself out. A development company called Ridgeline Partners had bought most of the block his workshop sat on, including the building itself, which he'd been renting for 18 years under a handshake-turn lease with the previous owner, old Harlan Vance, who died without ever bothering to write anything down properly. Ridgeline claimed the original lease had lapsed years earlier and that William was, technically, a tenant at will who could be given 30 days' notice, which they promptly gave him, along with a plan to demolish the block for a self-storage complex. William tried to fight it the way he fought everything, quietly, stubbornly, without much money for a lawyer. He found an old ledger of rent payments going back to 1998, argued that continuous acceptance of payment constituted an implied lease, and lost the first hearing anyway, because the judge said the paperwork Ridgeline presented looked cleaner than his memory did. He didn't tell Rin how bad it had gotten until the week before the appeal, and only because she called on a Sunday and could hear it in his voice, that particular flatness he got when he was trying not to worry her. "It's just a shop," he said, which was a lie they both understood. She drove to Millhaven that night instead of waiting for the weekend. She spent 2 days going through the county recorder's office, the old zoning records, and a box of Harlan Vance's personal papers that his elderly sister still had in a storage unit in Troy. What she found wasn't dramatic. No smoking gun, no confession. It was a series of small, boring documents. A 2003 amendment to the original lease that extended it automatically unless either party gave written notice, filed correctly, but misfiled under the wrong parcel number for 2 decades, and a pattern of Ridgeline's own internal appraisal reports that had quietly assumed the lease was valid when calculating the purchase price of the block. Their own numbers gave them away. At the appeal hearing, Rin didn't argue as William's daughter. She argued as counsel, because she was licensed to practice in the state, and because no one else could afford to take the case on short notice for what William could pay, which was nothing beyond covering her gas. She stood in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat and laid out the paperwork sentence by sentence, calm and unhurried, the way her father had taught her to sand wood, with the grain, not against it. Ridgeline's attorney tried to argue the misfiled amendment was irrelevant since it hadn't been in the correct file, and Rin simply asked whether a company's own appraisal error should transfer the cost of that error onto a tenant who'd paid rent faithfully for over 20 years. The judge took 11 days to rule. He ruled in William's favor. Not because anyone gasped in the courtroom, and not because it made headlines. It didn't, beyond a small item in the Millhaven Gazette, but because the paperwork, once someone bothered to actually read it in full, said what it said. Ridgeline could still develop the rest of the block. They just couldn't touch the shop, not for the length of the lease's remaining renewal terms, which ran another 9 years. Afterward, in the parking lot, William didn't say much, which was normal for him. He just stood by his truck for a while, looking at the building he'd almost lost, and then at Ren, who was still in the blazer she'd worn to argue the case, looking more tired than triumphant. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. "You didn't have to come back for this," he said eventually. "You didn't have to stop for me either," she said. 15 years ago. You could have kept driving." He didn't have an answer for that, so he just opened the truck door for her, the same way he had 100 small mornings before, and they drove back to the shop to open up for the day, because there was a rocking chair due for pickup on Thursday, and the wood wasn't going to sand itself. Comment, kindness still exists. If you believe even one good act can change someone's life. William still runs the shop. Ren still calls every Sunday at 7. Neither of them tells this story like it's remarkable, because to them it never felt like a rescue. Just 2 people who kept showing up for each other, in small ways, for a long time, until the small ways added up to something that held.